Act 3. For King and Country. Today we will teach you the art of war. The Sassanians are fast, strong, and large in numbers. They are in your land. They are in your home. They are pillaging your future. The one thing they don't have is this. Ahmed Fahad grabbed the chest plate of the smallest recruit on the front line and slammed his fist into the heart of his breastplate. The heart of a lion. You are a lion. We are lions. We are fewer in numbers, yes, but our spirit shall never die. Even in death, you may live forever. The king called all fighting-age men to the front lines of the war. Men of noble stature, common men, bakers, farmers. Today, they would all become warriors. The front row of recruits stood tall and proud, for they knew nothing of the war to come. Most of these men only learned of battle from bedtime stories. Ahmed looked up and down at the men as he removed his scarf from his neck. He slowly unraveled the scarf, revealing a jagged scar the shape of a lightning bolt. We have seen their kind before. I have met their kind on the battlefield. Many nations have tried to conquer our land. All that have tried have failed. Oafish Akkadians, gleeful Greeks, monstrous Mongols. But they all had one thing in common. One distinct disadvantage. The men gazed on at the courageous captain with a curious disposition. Abdul-Ahad, front and center. Abdul made his way to the front of the courtyard where the men were training. As he passed the first couple of rows, the recruits whispered among themselves. Ahmed made sure to spread rumors of his brawl with the Sassanian. This man single-handedly crushed in the skull of a Sassanian mercenary. I found the boy dining with his corpse. The Sassanian was near 10 feet tall and well over 300 pounds. With nothing more than his bare hands and his blacksmith hammer. This man has the heart of a lion. Today we will find out if that can be said about the rest of you. The largest man in the courtyard stood up from the makeshift stool he made out of a wine keg. He towered over the other men and pushed his way to the front of the line. If this man killed one Sassanian, then send me to fight the entire army. The recruits bellowed with nervous laughter. Ahmed smiled and looked up at the men. Ahmed's forehead met the better part of the man's chin. And what is your name, recruit? I am Qassar. How about we start with a test of strength? Qassar scrunched his brow and started bursting out in laughter. Lead the way, old man. See that brass container? Ahmed asked the young mountain of a man while pointing over the corner of the courtyard. Qassar slanted his head to the side and stared at the rotund brass keg. Abdul-Ahad looked from afar. His eagerness for revenge was only toppled by his love for competition. He slowly crept closer, making sure to stay unnoticed. What about it? Qassar asked. Whomever can move this keg will be first in line for a promotion. Let's say from one end of the courtyard to the other. Sound simple enough? Qassar laughed at the challenge and said, The first? If anyone else touches the keg, I shall squash them like a bug. Stand back. Qassar moved up to the keg, like Sisyphus preparing to push a boulder up a hill. Unfortunately for Qassar, he had about the same amount of luck as Sisyphus pushing that boulder up that hill. Qassar hugged the keg and quaked as he attempted to wrangle it. As hard as he tried, the keg did not move. As much as he ate, the keg did not move. As much as he fought, the keg fought back harder. The veins in Qassar's head pulsated like raging rivers after the melting of a snowpack. Ahmed shouted, Qassar, what are you waiting for? Your man is counting on you for this keg. Push yourself. Kassar's face turned redder than a perfectly ripened cherry tomato. Kassar huffed and puffed to no avail. After a few minutes, he loosened his grip from Keg and retreated to the center of the courtyard. Kassar stood in the center of the courtyard and bellowed with laughter. "Well, if I cannot do it, no man in this room can. Don't even bother." "Is he right? Can no man here move this keg? Am I to believe there is not a single man among you with the ability to move this keg?" The recruits looked to their sides and waited for a peer to step up. After a few seconds, Ahmed asked, "No one?" From the back of the courtyard, a soft voice spoke. "I will." A tiny man stepped into the forefront of the group. He flowed through the group like water around a polished stone. "Ah, and what, pray tell, is your name?" "I am Nasir." "Step right up, Nasir. Show us what you got." "This'll be quick," Kassar shouted. Nasir started knocking on the keg, searching for a chink in the armor. The knocks reverberated throughout the courtyard. He shook his head and said, "Simple." He twisted off the lid of the keg and yanked down as hard as he could. The keg toppled over, spilling the water into the courtyard. The waves crashed along the feet of the soon-to-be soldiers. He kicked up his foot onto the keg and rolled it over to the end of the courtyard. Nasir smiled while backing away from the keg. He bowed with his arms extended, like the curtsy of a ballerina. Clap, clap, clap. "Look at that ingenuity. You could all learn a lesson from Nasir. A lesson as to what not to do." Nasir looked back at Ahmed with confusion. He planted his hands firmly on his hips and questioned his captain. "I moved the keg, just like you asked." "You did. You moved the keg, and in a rather clever way, I might add. However, that keg had your men's entire water supply for the journey through the desert. Now you are all dead. Congratulations." Nasir's smirk quickly whittled away as the captain spoke those somber words of encouragement. "Back of the line, soldier. What was the point of the exercise? Can someone enlighten me?" "Brain over brawn?" Abdul-Ahad asked his new captain. "No, I wanted to find out how you worked as a team. I wanted a leader to emerge. Not one of you managed to impress me. The only way to move this keg, without cheating, would have been as a team. Work as a team, or die one by one. It is your choice on the battlefield. Strength does not just come from your muscles, but from your head and your heart. The true test of strength will come down to the decisions you make on the battlefield. When to run, when to hide, when to engage." Ahmed roamed over towards a barrel of metal training swords and began to pluck them out of the barrel. He walked over to half a dozen hanging pigs and started flinging the swords at the feet of his men. The swords were dull and rusted down to nubs of bent metal. "Now, we will test your endurance. This is a pig, the animal closest in tone, texture, and smell to a Sassanian. And no, Kassar, this is not a test of your stomach. This is a test of endurance." "What do you expect us to do with it exactly?" Kassar asked. "I want you to swing your sword at this pig until you mangle the carcass beyond recognition. I want you to swing your sword until it breaks in half. I want you to swing your sword until you chop this pig into 2 halves." Kassar swung at the pig with all his might. Each blow of his sword smashed the pig's bones into a pulverized dust. The sound of the strike echoed throughout the courtyard and beyond the walls of the palace. With every swing of the beleaguered blade, sweat flung across the courtyard, like droplets of water spewing from a broken sprinkler. One by one, the recruits' relentless battering of the pigs dwindled down to a few exhausted, pattering slaps. Abdul-Ahad took a moment of rest to examine his hands. One of the men huffed and puffed until he began to dry heave and cave over in exhaustion. "Tired already?" The boy picked up his head and asked, "I don't see the point." "What is your name?" "Yasser, sir." "Pick up your sword and keep swinging, Yasser. That goes for the lot of you. Do you think the Sassanians will tire? Do you think they will give you a break? Do you think they will show you mercy? Swing or die." "Not quite like a blacksmith hammer, eh?" Ahmed said demandingly to his naive protege. "Not quite, sir." "Keep going, like your lives depend on it. Pick up the slack." Qassar's mighty arm began to falter. He momentarily plunged the point of his sword into the ground. The gravel of the courtyard was fine as sand and as clumpy as clay. Qassar looked down at his feet as he collected his breath. His leather sandals were drenched in sweat, which produced more of a brownish hue that matched his skin tone. Ahmed lurked over to the young behemoth. His shadow dwarfed the young man from behind. As Qassar labored to reclaim his composure, he pleaded with the captain. "I need a break, Captain." "A break?" the captain asked politely while shaking his head. Ahmed bent a knee to meet Qassar at eye level. He patted him on the back and whispered into his enormous ear. Qassar's breathing noticeably hastened as the two men quietly conversed. Ahmed stood up and shouted, "A break! The Sassanians will not be so kind. The Sassanians will provide you with no such opportunities. The Sassanians will show you no mercy. Swing!" Abdul-Ahad picked his sword back up. The weight sunk his shoulders like the anchor of a yacht dredging the bottom of the sea. On this day, he would prove his worth. "Giving up already, Qassar?" Nasser asked his fellow soldier. Qassar flicked his sword away in anger, like a child throwing a temper tantrum on the playground. He stormed away from the pig and sat down next to the other exhausted soldiers. Nasser looked over to the remaining soldiers. Only 3 men were left swinging. And then there were just 3. The infamous Abdul-Ahad, Nasser, and who are you? "My name is Asad, sir." "And yes, Asad." The 3 men all lumbered over and started sucking down oxygen at an aggressive speed. Pools of sweat dampened the courtyard around the 3 men in large concentric circles. Sweat exuded off their skin like moisture wrung from a damp cloth. Nasser slowly blew out a breath, like the slow exhaust before a birthday wish. Overcome with thorowing exhaustion, Nasser abandoned his grip on the sword and dropped to his knees. "And then there were 2. Who will win? Who will endure?" Qassar shouted, "I'd put my money on Abdul-Ahad, the infamous Abdul-Ahad." Asad looked back at Qassar and winked his left eye. "Continue!" the captain shouted at the top of his lungs. As the 2 men swung, the sun stooped over the courtyard of the palace. The other men formed a crescent half-circle around Abdul-Ahad and Asad. The mangled corpses of the hung pigs dangled on the end of the ropes. Chunks of tattered pig flesh scattered around the feet of the 2 men. Abdul-Ahad looked over at Asad in order to gauge his composure. Asad was breathing heavily, but seemed to have an endless supply of energy. There was a sense of determination in his eyes. It was in that moment Abdul-Ahad realized he would not win this competition. He slowly withdrew his sword from the inner belly of the swine and backed away from the carcass of the pig. "Looks like we have a winner." Abdul-Ahad smirked in defeat for some reason. Asad kept striking the pig. The men looked at Asad with a plague of confusion. "Asad, you can stop striking the pig." Asad, unfazed by the command of his captain, continued to strike the pig with a relentless fervor. "Asad, the captain said while grabbing the dull training blade with his bare hand. Asad broke his trance and looked over at the captain. "Let it go, son," Ahmed said to the exuberant soldier. Asad relinquished his sword and slightly bowed his head at the captain. "They killed my family," he whispered under his breath. Asad fixated on the pig and tightened the grip of his hands. His fingernails dug into his flesh as he angrily balled his fist up. Ahmed Fahad placed the training sword in his sheath and grabbed the shoulder of Asad. He leaned in close and said, "I know, son, I know. I can guarantee you one thing." Asad looked up at the captain as he said, "There is a time for vengeance. This I can promise you. Save your energy for the Sassanians." The men scattered to various cliques among the recruits. The captain allowed for a brief respite as he made preparations for the next test. Minutes turned into hours, hours into an afternoon. The stomachs of the men growled eagerly as the time passed. Ahmed gathered a bundle of wooden swords and tossed them at the feet of the soldiers. "Sparring is not fighting. Sparring is practice. Practice makes perfect, men." "What does wooden sword fighting have to do with real battle?" Abdul-Ahad asked the captain. "How many of you have killed? Why are we practicing with wooden swords? Repeat after me. Sweat saves blood, blood saves lives, but brains save both." The chorus of soldiers shouted, "Sweat saves blood, blood saves lives, but brains save both." "Say it again, louder, shout it to the heavens." "Sweat saves blood, blood saves lives, but brains save both." Ahmed pumped his fist into Kassar's chest and said, "We are practicing with wooden swords, so when the time comes, you do not hesitate to kill. I can guarantee you this much. The Sassanian on the other end of his spear will not hesitate. He will kill without remorse. He will kill without hesitation. He will leave your body for the crows and feel no way about it." Kassar scoffed and said, "Me hesitate?" Kassar paired off with Nasser and began to spar. Kassar swung widely and with terrible force. He missed high, he missed wide. Nasser ducked, rolled, and moved around Kassar with ease. Ahmed Fahad stepped behind Nasser and shoved him into range of Kassar. Nasser flinched as the distance closed and Kassar slammed him in the side with his sword. Nasser spun to the ground and flung his sword as he fell to the ground. "If I hesitate, I die. Repeat after me. Commit it to memory." "If I hesitate, I die," the group chanted. "Good. Again." Abdul-Ahad picked up Nasser's discarded training sword and squared off with Ahmed Fahad. Ahmed started laughing at the show of bravado from the tenderfoot. "I hope you do not expect me to go easy on you, Abdul-Ahad." "I would not dream of it," he said while hoisting up his sword. Ahmed Fahad inspected his training sword and snapped it in half like a twig. "There, now it is a fair fight. Maybe I will just use one hand as well." Abdul-Ahad smirked and rushed headstrong into battle. Ahmed sidestepped the overzealous blacksmith and slapped him across the face with a shortened sword. The sword left a large red welt on the side of Abdul's left cheek. "Rush in, get slaughtered. Let the Sassanians make the mistakes. We do not make mistakes. We are lions." Abdul-Ahad spit out a goblet of blood and dropped to the ground, his sword still clenched firmly in the grasp of his hand. "Again?" Ahmed asked. "Again," he replied to the captain. Abdul-Ahad stood up to his feet and the rest of the men began watching the sparring session. 5 minutes of sparring turned into 10, and then another 10 turned into an hour. The two men danced throughout the courtyard, like brawling siblings deadlocked in an endless duel. As the sunlight faded away into the later hours of the evening, the two men quivered with adrenaline and succumbed to exhaustion. Ahmed tucked his training sword into his armpit and bowed at his young apprentice. Abdul-Ahad tossed the sword aside and nodded his head at the captain. After a few moments of catching his breath, Ahmed said, "Now it is time to pick your weapon." Ahmed casually strolled over to a large covered trove of weapons. The battalion followed their captain, and each man began to peruse the assortment of weapons. Qassar shoved the onlookers out of the way and fixated himself on a large wooden war club. The war club was a solid piece of rounded red oak that reached nearly a meter in length. He snatched the leather-bound handle of the war club with a single hand. Even for the massive hand of Qassar, the girth of the club required two hands to properly wield. Qassar took the war club to the center of the courtyard and began to swing the club over his head. Nasser's eyes were caught by the glimmer of wavy daggers. 11 daggers were tightly wrapped into an interwoven leather blade carrying case. He took both hands and detached the carrying case from the treasure trove of weapons. The wavy daggers jingled as they moved. He tightly secured the case around his waistline and began to examine the daggers in further detail. One by one he pulled out the daggers, feeling the weight and spinning the blades. Asad spotted an all-too-familiar weapon from his village. He walked up and grabbed a curved bow from the weapons inventory. He balanced the bow and began to rapidly but gently pull the string. The rest of the battalion armed themselves with various weaponry. "Do you know how to use that?" Asad looked over at the captain and confidently smiled. "I am a hunter, sir." "That doesn't answer my question. Do you know how to use that?" "Would you like to find out?" "That's the spirit," Ahmed said while grabbing another bow from the inventory. Asad notched an arrow and easily shot one of the unlit lanterns hanging in the courtyard. The lantern was about 20 or so feet in the air and slowly wafting in the cool breeze. "Good shot. But can you do it when it counts? Under pressure? When it comes down to life or death? When the single shot of an arrow can mean the difference between a brethren dying or living?" "I've never come home empty-handed." Ahmed scoffed and shouted, "Qassar, grab a couple of apples from the bushel over there, and don't eat them." Qassar retrieved 2 fully ripened apples from the barrel and held them in his hands with a somewhat confused look on his face. "Put one on your head." Qassar cautiously obliged at the order. The apple rested firmly on the giant head of Qassar. "Now the question is, hunter, can you do it when it matters?" he asked Asad. Asad looked over at his nervous comrade and confidently nodded his head. "Don't move, Qassar," he said while notching another arrow. Asad slowly drew his arrow and pulled his bowstring. Asad squinted his left eye to narrow his field of vision. Qassar stretched open his eyelids, completely exposing the whites of his eyes. Sweat slowly dripped down his forehead, like the slow drip of a broken faucet. Qassar's immense lungs filled with dry air, hulking his chest as big as a blowfish. Ahmed snuck up behind Asad and loudly clapped his hands behind his ear. His concentration broke and the arrow whirled past Qassar's head, missing his ear by several inches. To Qassar's praise, he did not flinch a single muscle. "Hunting is hunting. It is not warfare." "I was distracted," Asad responded bitterly to his captain. "And you expect the Sassanians to do what? Do you expect them to walk on eggshells? Should they prance around wearing velvet slippers? Notch another arrow and get to work, or pick up a sword." Asad quickly notched another arrow and refocused his aim on the apple. He squinted his left eye and started tracking his breathing. As he took in the dry air of the courtyard, his other senses became heightened. His field of view narrowed, focusing out everything except the apple. Kassar was standing about 20 feet away from the archer, sweating like a pig. Asad inhaled a deep breath, and at the top of the breath held it. As he slowly exhaled the breath, he effortlessly released the arrow from his grip. The arrow whirled across the courtyard. In a flash, the arrow struck through the apple, propelling it to the ground. Kassar's face turned completely pale, and he began furiously rummaging around on his head. To his surprise, there was no arrow. To his surprise, there was no apple. To his surprise, Asad pulled it off. Ahmed walked over to the archer and patted him on the shoulder. "Not bad, hunter. Not bad at all," he said while walking back to the group. Nasser began rearranging the daggers into various slots on his uniform. He spun the daggers in his hands and effortlessly packed them away. "Close quarters combat?" "I prefer short blades for my long arms." "Word of advice, Nasser. Never stick a tall man with a short blade. You'll only anger him or get yourself killed in the process." Ahmed motioned Nasser to attack him. Nasser hesitated for a moment, and Ahmed slapped him in the face. Nasser pulled one of the daggers from his torso holster and lunged at Ahmed. Ahmed sidestepped the young man and parried the dagger with his wooden training sword. "You'll need to do better than that if you expect to best a Sassanian." Nasser advanced with the daggers, and Ahmed thrust his training sword into the navel of his belly. The young villager caved over as he attempted to gasp for oxygen. The fleeting breaths failed to recover the young man, like a fish out of water, slowly gasping for air. "You'll need to do better than that." Nasser pulled one of the daggers from his boot and recklessly flung it at the captain. The dagger spun awkwardly at the captain, swiftly spinning tip over heel. Ahmed pivoted on the balls of his heel and swung his training sword at the dagger. The dagger shot out of the courtyard and tumbled to the ground outside of the palace. "Not bad, Nasser. Desperate, but not bad," he said while sheathing his sword and extending his hand to Nasser. Nasser obliged, and the captain pulled him up to his feet. He dusted off the young man as he stood up. Ahmed bowed at the battalion of men and said, "Rest up tonight, because tomorrow we go to war. This battalion will lead the way. The Sassanians will regret the day they decided to step foot on our land. That I can promise you, men." On the next morning, the men awoke to the call of their captain. They ate heartily, as if it was their final meal, but quickly, as if it were an afternoon snack. The men mounted their camels and rode to the nearest village. An hour passed, and then another. Before the men realized it, half the day passed by, and they had arrived at a village. A long whistle of the wind roared through the valley and induced a sense of ire among the battalion. The nearest village was just on the other side of the river. From the looks of the village, smoke plumed from the fireplaces and animals wandered about. From the distance of the hilltop overlooking the river, no person could be seen. "Nasser, Asad, go scout the village. The rest of you, stay vigilant." The two men dismounted their respective camels and embarked towards the village. They followed the tree line down the hilltop and began traversing the riverbed behind the village. As the men crossed the river, the battalion inched closer and closer to the village. Each man began to dismount and ready their arms. In the distance, Nasser and Asad climbed one of the huts and started waving at the battalion. The battalion of 50 men set down the hilltop towards the village, like the long march of ants on an anthill. "The village looks abandoned from the looks of it, sir." "Abandoned?" the captain replied. "Not a soul in sight, sir," Nasser said to his captain. Thump, thump, thump. As the distant thumping of Sassanian war drums pounded, the newly formed battalion reactively rushed down the hill towards the presumed safety of the village. Ahmed froze on his camel as his soldiers broke rank, like the scattering of a gaggle of geese suddenly fleeing a watering hole. "It's a trap!" Thump, thump, thump. The frequency of the thumping incrementally hastened, and the tremble of the thumping boosted. "Ahmed!" "I walked us right into a trap." "Ahmed! Snap out of it, sir. Your men need you," Abdul-Ahad said while slapping his captain across the cheek. The slap instantly woke Ahmed from his trance. He shook his head and rode towards the center of the vacant village. He dismounted his camel and yelled, "Form up on me!" The battalion of men loosely formed a circle around the courageous captain. The huts of the village formed a disjointed perimeter around the men. The mound swelled with Sassanians. From every side they were completely surrounded by the enemy. The front line of the battalion swayed side by side, like a piece of driftwood floating in the high tide. The Sassanians hoisted large black and yellow war banners as they marched down to the village. The captain gulped and placed his hand on the hilt of his sword. Now is not the time for glorious speeches. Now is not the time for rousing words of wisdom. Now is not the time to cower behind his men. Ahmed pushed past the rows of his nervous countrymen, hoisted up his sword, and shouted, "Even in death, we may live forever!" In a reflexive unison, the dozens of men under his command simultaneously hoisted their weapons toward the sky and shouted in chorus, "Even in death, we may live forever!" Thump, thump, thump. Historians would write poems of valor on this day. The men fought well. The men fought to no avail. The men fought to the very end. In the skirmish, Ahmed, Abdul-Ahad, Qassar, Nasir, and Asad suffered numerous abrasions, cuts, and bruises. The blubbery blood of the battalion soaked the ground. The blood of the battalion drenched the skin of the 5 men. Somehow, in all of the confusion, the blood lathered the men like a camouflage. The drunken Sassanian army passed each man without so much as a hint of circumspection. The 5 men lay tattered and scattered among the corpses of the fallen Afghan battalion. Ahmed made slight gestures to each man. Instinctively, they froze in place. As the night fell upon the village, the Sassanians became increasingly drunk. Ahmed gripped onto his sword with a ferocious intensity. The Sassanians crookedly stumbled around the village, completely unaware of the looming threat. They discarded any semblance of formality, any notion of tactical presence, and most importantly, each man began to disarm. Throughout the night, Ahmed crawled on his back, closer and closer to his comrades. He moved 1 inch at a time. He moved in the shadows. He moved under the bodies of his fallen comrades. "Abdul-Ahad!" Abdul-Ahad did not so much as flinch, calcified by the stench of his fallen comrades. He was petrified by the abeyance of the battle to come. "Abdul," he pleaded with his comrade. Abdul-Ahad looked over to his unflappable captain. Ahmed's face was lathered with a crimson blood and body smeared with bile. "When they fall asleep, we launch our attack." Abdul-Ahad, Nasir, Asad, and Qassar all looked over at their captain and nodded in solidarity. No training in the world could have prepared the tenderfoot soldiers for this moment. Ahmed was all too aware of the odds, but confident in his men nonetheless. On this day he would earn his self-proclaimed title of the famous Ahmed Fahad. Time marched on as slow as embers fading from the dwindling logs on the campfire. The Sassanians drank booze like it was water. As the Sassanians ran dry of libations, the night sky drowned the village in total darkness. Ahmed slowly unsheathed his sword and placed it across his chest. He cautiously pivoted his head and nodded to the rest of the men. Each man drew the nearest weapon and prepared for some payback. As the fire drew down at the campfire, the Sassanians started to urinate into the flames. Ahmed pushed off the corpses of his fallen comrades and daringly dashed towards the campfire. The campfire was surrounded by a baker's dozen of battle-hardened Sassanians, some of them drunk, some of them sleeping, some of them dancing around the fire. The other 4 men hopped up, weapons drawn, and followed their captain into certain death. Each man leaped into the fray and began slashing up the Sassanians. The Sassanians had been shouting and hollering all night, but this was a different kind of screaming. These were the screams of panic. These were the screams of terror. One of the Sassanians woke from his drunk stupor and sprinted towards the makeshift barracks. Qassar took his sword and flung it at the Sassanian. The sword flung with such force it managed to split the Sassanian clean in half. The men were ruthlessly efficient and as quiet as Akkadian assassins. The men tenderly crept into the barracks of sleeping Sassanians. One by one, they silently avenged their comrades in arms, down to the very last man. After cutting down the entire battalion of Sassanians, all of the men returned to the campfire and collapsed to a knee. Each man barely clung on to life. Even Qassar used his sword as an old man used a cane. In the corner of his eye, Nasser caught a wavy piece of leather flapping in the wind. On one of the Sassanian corpses, a mangled leather map was dangling from his pocket. Nasser bent down and snatched the map out of the Sassanian's pocket. The map covered the better part of the borders of Afghanistan. Elongated X's marked the maps, crossing out various villages that Sassanians undoubtedly sacked. Nasser spit on the corpse of the Sassanian in disgust and slammed the map into the chestplate of Qassar. Qassar held the map in between his palm and the armor of his chestplate. He threw his sword into the sand and began to examine the tarnished map. "Ahmed!" he yelled to his captain while waving him over. Qassar dragged his forearm across his mouth, wiping away the Sassanian blood from his chiseled chin. He handed over the map to his captain for further inspection. After a few seconds of catching his breath, he walked around the village to find his war club. Ahmed simultaneously sheathed his sword and caught the map with his outstretched hand. Ahmed began to walk around in small concentric circles and outlined the details on the map. He stopped dead in his tracks. Ahmed's eyebrows spontaneously scrunched. Ahmed's nostrils flared. Ahmed's eyes glazed over as he read the map. "They have found the goat trail. They could walk right up to the doorsteps of the palace. We need to inform the king at once." The men rode fast. The men rode furious. The men rode until the camels could ride no more. Meters turned into miles, and miles turned into hours. As the men passed Abdul-Ahad's village at the bottom of the valley, the camels collapsed from exhaustion, hurling the men in every direction. The men climbed the mound of the valley and sprinted up the path to the palace. As the men made their ascent, nightfall had turned into daybreak. "Who goes there?" Ahmed completely abandoned his respect for authority and plunged his hands firmly onto the doors of the palace gate. Qassar and Ahmed shoved the doors open, and the men stormed into the palace. The guardsmen gripped onto their swords, and Qassar walloped the largest guard with his war club. The other guardsmen slowly withdrew any hostilities and formality as the 5 lions entered the throne room. "We have seen their kind before," the king proclaimed while clutching onto a goblet of wine. "My king, they know nothing but terror. The Sassanians are on a warpath to this very palace," Ahmed shouted to the room of bureaucrats and sycophants. "Sire, if I may." "Ah, yes, Abdul-Ahad. Please, speak plainly, Blacksmith." Abdul-Ahad took a deep breath and said, The Sassanians have plagued this land for too long. If the Sassanians yearn for war, we shall deliver them war. On our terms, not on their terms. Abdul-Ahad tossed the map onto the ground in front of the king. One of the king's closest confidants scurried over to the map and snatched it off the ground. He began to inspect the map. His face quickly turned pale as he realized the contents of the map. He began to fervently whisper into the ear of the king. The king waved him off, and he descended the throne. Where is the rest of your battalion? Ahmed gulped and raised his chin up in the air. He licked the tips of his lips with a slow, exacting tongue lashing. His lips were cracked with scraggy abrasions from the dry heat of the desert and tasted of warm salt water. They died for the kingdom of Afghanistan. They died for their country. They died for you, Ahmed shouted. The king walked down from his perch and began to inspect the battle-hardened soldiers standing in front of him, the sobering reality of the war finally piercing his thick skull. Each of you men have met the Sassanians in battle. Each of you men have bested them in battle. Each of you men have outsmarted them in battle. On our terms, yes. The Sassanians may be large in numbers. This is not their land. This is not their home. The topography is as familiar to us as the marks on the top of our hands. From birth you men have lived off the fat of the land, breathed the air and faced the elements. We will draw them into the mouth of the Panjshir Valley and crush them like pebbles under the wheels of a carriage. Yes, they are strong. Yes, they are fast. They are also sloppy. There we will make our stand among the cover of forest, choking them into the mouth of the valley. Their numbers in open combat we cannot defeat. If we can funnel them into the mouth of the valley, we can stop them once and for all. The king snapped his fingers, and his entire detachment of royal guards sprang to the front of the room. They lined up in a long row with their chests puffed out, like a bunch of pufferfish covered in leather armor. My personal guard will fight alongside of you. Ahmed started rocking his head back and forth, like the slow rhythm of a baby's cradle. Have any of these men seen battle? The king's chest began to expand like the pregnant belly of an expecting mother. I believe what he meant, sire, was that in case they make it past the 5 of us, your royal guardsmen should defend the palace. True lions. Yes, why send 200 sheep when I could send 5 lions? If not manpower, what other provisions can I provide you? Ahmed looked over at Qassar and pointed to the curtains with a quick nod of the head. Qassar smiled and returned a nod in acknowledgement to his captain. Ahmed placed his hands firmly behind the swell of his back and said, Your Majesty, we could use some banners. A small donation to the war effort, indeed. Qassar walked over to the curtains. The massive warrior's feet stomped across the throne room to the royal tapestries. He examined the cloth and began to rip the drapes down from the ceiling. Sunlight shot into the throne room for the first time in eons. The beams of the sunlight danced around the room like a drunken ballerina spinning around a stage after a recital. The 5 lions all stared out into the basking glow of the